The director blamed me 3 minutes after the Navy auditors entered the building. Almost 100 senior managers sat inside the San Diego Executive Conference Hall that morning. Nobody touched their coffee after she said my name. The room overlooked the harbor. Gray Pacific fog rolled past the windows behind the executive stage, while federal procurement investigators waited quietly near the back wall beside corporate legal. I remember noticing small things first. A vice president stopped typing mid-sentence. Someone near finance lowered their laptop screen immediately. Even the air conditioning sounded louder afterward. The director stood beneath the presentation monitor, wearing a white executive blazer and controlled expression. She always looked composed during public meetings. That was part of her reputation. Calm leadership under pressure, at least from a distance. The audit discrepancy displayed behind her in red numbers large enough for the entire room to read. $9.8 million. Pacific Fleet contract exposure. Inventory reconciliation failure. Potential compliance escalation. Then she said operational oversight failures inside my division caused the discrepancy. Not loudly. Worse. Professionally. That was the moment the room shifted toward me. Some people looked uncomfortable. Others relieved. Corporate environments react quickly when blame finds a destination. I stayed seated for several seconds after she finished speaking. No panic. No anger. Mostly exhaustion. For nearly 4 years I had arrived before 7 every morning while she entered after 10 carrying presentation folders and board summaries. I coordinated overnight shipment reroutes across Guam, Hawaii, Okinawa, and Yokosuka while leadership discussed quarterly visibility metrics. I approved emergency substitutions during typhoon delays. I stabilized vendor collapses quietly during Pacific supply interruptions. And somewhere along the way the company started confusing invisibility with replaceability. The director continued speaking above the projection screen. Operational inconsistency. Documentation gaps. Breakdown in authorization controls. The language sounded carefully rehearsed. Not for truth. For containment. That detail mattered. Because federal investigators were already inside the building before the meeting began. Most executives did not know that yet. I did. I noticed them entering through the South Security Corridor 37 minutes earlier while walking from logistics review upstairs. 2 procurement investigators. 1 federal compliance attorney. 1 digital evidence specialist. Nobody from leadership recognized them immediately because they were not wearing uniforms. That is how procedural collapses usually begin in corporate America. Quietly. If you enjoy realistic workplace thrillers grounded in invisible expertise and institutional collapse, subscribe and stay with me through this one. Because this meeting was not the beginning of the disaster. It was simply the first moment leadership realized the system no longer belonged to them. The director finally turned toward me directly. Then she asked whether I wanted to explain the missing inventory authorization chain to the executive group. Almost 100 people watching. Complete silence. I stood slowly from the operations table near the rear section of the room. Adjusted my jacket. Straightened the folder in front of me. Then I looked toward the federal investigators near the back wall before speaking 7 words that instantly changed the atmosphere inside the entire building. Federal investigators already reviewed the authorization chain. Nobody moved afterward. Not immediately. But 3 seconds later, one of the investigators near the rear exit quietly lifted his phone and said something into it. And at the exact same moment, every executive security badge inside the director's office suite stopped working. 3 years earlier, the company still felt manageable. Complicated, but manageable. I worked from the San Diego Operations Tower near the Naval Logistics Corridor south of downtown. Most mornings I arrived before sunrise. The harbor lights were usually still visible from the parking structure when I walked inside, carrying overnight shipment reports and Pacific routing updates. Nobody asked me to come in that early. The systems simply worked better when someone watched them before the executive layer arrived. Pacific Fleet supply coordination never really slept. Japan moved while California rested. Guam triggered requests while Washington executives attended dinner events. Containers shifted between contractors overnight because storms delayed loading windows near Okinawa or fuel schedules changed near Pearl Harbor. Most people only saw successful deliveries. I saw the unstable machinery underneath them. The director never touched those systems directly. She handled executive communication, board visibility, quarterly reviews, strategic language. She was excellent in front of leadership groups. Confident, polished, fast under pressure. Executives loved people who simplified complexity into clean presentations. Operational reality rarely stayed clean long enough for presentations. At first, I believed our arrangement worked. She protected visibility upward. I protected continuity downward. That balance held for almost 2 years. Then delivery targets accelerated. The Navy contract expanded across additional Pacific support routes, while subcontractor reliability quietly deteriorated behind the scenes. Small operational exceptions started appearing weekly. Emergency vendor substitutions, temporary inventory balancing, manual authorization overrides during shipment delays. Nothing catastrophic individually. That was the dangerous part. The system learned to normalize instability. One evening around 8:40 p.m., I stayed alone reviewing Yokosuka inventory reconciliation reports after most executives already left for the night. Rain hit the windows hard enough to blur the harbor lights outside. I noticed the same shipment container appearing twice under different routing authorizations. Same container number, different inventory destinations. At first, I assumed clerical duplication. Then I traced the approval chain. The override authorization came from an executive access credential linked to my operational division, but I never approved it. I checked the timestamp again. 2:13 a.m. I had been asleep at home. That should have been impossible. I reviewed 6 more weeks of shipment adjustments afterward. More duplicates appeared. Different vendors. Different routing delays. Same pattern. Emergency continuity override. Manual balancing authorization. Temporary reconciliation correction pending audit review. The wording repeated too precisely. That was the first moment I realized the company was no longer solving operational instability. It was administratively managing visibility around it. The invisible map started there. Not with money. Not with corruption. With language. Every unstable system eventually develops protective vocabulary. Operational flexibility. Temporary balancing. Pending reconciliation. Continuity adjustment. The words became insulation between leadership and reality. Meanwhile, I kept fixing the actual problems manually. Calling subcontractors in Guam before dawn. Rerouting inventory from Pearl Harbor overnight. Negotiating emergency substitutions with suppliers near Osaka during typhoon season. Nobody above operations fully understood how fragile the network had become. That fragility became invisible because people like me absorbed the instability quietly before executives ever saw it. About 6 months later, the director started taking greater personal control over authorization timing. That change felt subtle initially. More requests arrived verbally. Fewer approvals appeared formally documented. Then one Friday evening, after almost everyone left the building, she stopped beside my desk, holding a thin blue executive folder, and asked whether I would be willing to use my operational credentials more flexibly during urgent contract situations. I understood what she was asking before she finished the sentence. Not illegal approvals. Something quieter. More dangerous. Administrative flexibility. That phrase started appearing everywhere afterward. At first, the requests sounded temporary. A delayed shipment needed balancing before reconciliation finalized. A subcontractor substitution needed operational continuity approval before formal vendor review completed. An inventory mismatch needed correction before quarterly reporting locked. Always temporary. Always urgent. Always positioned as protecting the contract. The Pacific Fleet schedules created constant pressure. Missed delivery windows affected refueling operations. Equipment delays triggered cascading problems across multiple bases. Leadership became obsessed with continuity metrics because executive compensation now depended heavily on expansion performance. That changed the company faster than most people realized. Operational discipline slowly became secondary to delivery visibility. The director adapted immediately. She started bypassing formal review channels whenever timing threatened executive reporting schedules. Nothing dramatic. Mostly verbal approvals. Phone calls. Late-night office visits. Requests without email trails. That was when I started documenting everything privately. Not because I planned to expose anyone. Because the operational architecture no longer matched the documentation architecture. That difference kept growing. I bought a black hardcover notebook from a small office supply store near Coronado. No cloud backup. No digital indexing. Just dates. Approvals. Shipment reroutes. Vendor substitutions. Authorization timing. I wrote quietly between overnight calls and logistics reviews while the harbor lights reflected against the conference room glass after midnight. The invisible map expanded slowly, one inconsistency at a time. A container supposedly delivered to Guam appeared later inside Pearl Harbor inventory balancing records. Emergency procurement approvals bypassed standard reconciliation sequencing repeatedly near Okinawa. Temporary substitutions somehow remained active for months after formal expiration dates. The patterns alone disturbed me, but what unsettled me more was leadership behavior surrounding them. Nobody above operations asked deeper questions anymore. Executives only cared whether deliveries continued appearing green on quarterly dashboards. The director became increasingly confident during board reviews. I watched her present operational stability metrics using systems held together manually by exhausted coordinators working 12-hour overnight rotations. People applauded her presentations. Meanwhile, my operations staff ate vending machine dinners at 1:30 in the morning while rebuilding shipment continuity after contractor failures. That contrast stayed with me. One Thursday night near fiscal quarter close, I remained inside the office past 9 o'clock reviewing Pacific inventory adjustments after everyone else left. The building felt almost silent except for ventilation noise and distant harbor traffic. I opened a shipment authorization report connected to emergency rerouting approvals near Guam. My operational credentials appeared again. Manual continuity override approved. But this time the authorization included an attached executive escalation note. I recognized the formatting immediately. The director's assistant prepared those summaries personally before board reviews. My stomach tightened for the first time in months. Because the approval chain showed something impossible. The executive escalation note had been created 14 hours before the shipment disruption officially existed in the system. I stared at the timestamp for almost a full minute. The disruption report entered the system at 11:42 a.m. Guam time. The executive escalation note attached to my authorization chain was created the previous evening, 14 hours earlier, before the disruption officially existed. That changed everything. Until then, I believed leadership was reacting recklessly to operational instability. Now another possibility emerged quietly beneath the surface. Some disruptions were being anticipated internally before documentation appeared operationally. I printed the records immediately, not through my office printer, through a disconnected logistics terminal 2 floors below procurement review. Then I added another section inside the notebook. Predictive authorization timing. That category expanded faster than I expected. Over the next 6 months, I found repeated examples across Pacific routing systems. Emergency inventory balancing requests drafted before shortages appeared formally documented. Vendor substitution approvals prepared before contractors officially reported delays. Manual override language copied almost identically across unrelated shipment disruptions. The invisible map became larger than inventory discrepancies. This was no longer about operational chaos. It was about administrative choreography surrounding instability. The company had started treating procedural exposure like weather patterns, something to route around instead of correct structurally. That realization exhausted me more than it frightened me, because by then the entire supply chain depended on invisible operational workarounds happening below executive visibility. Every successful quarter hid thousands of undocumented stabilizations, overnight reroutes, emergency inventory balancing, manual vendor substitutions, temporary storage reallocations, unreported labor overruns. The system survived because exhausted operations staff quietly prevented collapse every day. Leadership only measured outcomes. Nobody measured hidden strain. Around that time, Pacific Fleet acceleration pressure intensified sharply after new regional deployment demands expanded across multiple naval support corridors. Everything moved faster. Deadlines shortened. Tolerance for delays disappeared. The director became almost impossible to reach formally. Most instructions arrived indirectly through assistants or late-night calls. Documentation quality deteriorated immediately afterward. One Saturday near quarter close, I drove downtown after midnight because a Yokosuka shipment discrepancy threatened delivery continuity into Pearl Harbor staging inventory. The office tower was almost empty when I arrived. Only security staff and overnight operations remained. While reviewing authorization logs near the executive support floor, I noticed lights still active inside the director's office suite. That alone felt unusual. She rarely stayed late. I was walking past the corridor when I heard my name quietly through the partially open conference room door. I stopped instinctively. Not close enough to be visible, just close enough to hear fragments. Exposure timeline. Authorization layering. Containment positioning. Then one sentence. Operations absorbs this if audit scope stays financial. I remember standing completely still afterward. Because in that moment, I finally understood something larger than inventory discrepancies or shipment instability. The company was not trying to prevent operational failure anymore. It was trying to manage who could legally see the full architecture underneath it. That was the real invisible map, not logistics, visibility. And the dangerous part was this. I do not think the director fully understood how large the exposure already was either. Because while leadership focused on protecting quarterly continuity metrics, the operational systems had quietly started generating permanent digital trails across Navy procurement databases, federal subcontractor reporting systems, and archived authorization servers outside corporate control. The evidence no longer existed only inside the company. 3 weeks later, federal procurement auditors requested historical reconciliation access covering the previous 24 months across Pacific operations. And for the first time since joining the company, I saw genuine fear inside corporate legal. Corporate legal moved into the operations floor 2 days after the audit request arrived. Not permanently, just enough to change the atmosphere. Conference room doors stayed closed longer. Executives stopped carrying phones into sensitive meetings. People switched from email to short verbal conversations near elevators and parking structures. Nobody explained the shift openly. They did not need to. In large companies, fear spreads operationally before it spreads emotionally. The first formal preservation notice arrived on a Tuesday morning at 6:12 a.m. while I was reviewing overnight Pacific routing updates. Do not delete or alter records connected to procurement operations review. Neutral wording. Calm language. But the recipient list told the real story. Corporate legal. Executive operations. Procurement compliance. My division. The director forwarded the notice to me 3 minutes later with a short message. Need alignment before investigators expand requests. Alignment. Another protective corporate word. I stared at that message longer than I expected. Because by then I already understood something leadership still refused to admit. The audit was no longer financial. It had become architectural. Investigators were beginning to see how undocumented operational continuity really functioned underneath executive reporting systems. That terrified the company far more than missing inventory. Over the next week, the director requested multiple private meetings with me. Always late afternoon. Always after most managers already left. Her tone changed completely from previous years. Less executive confidence. More controlled urgency. One evening, she closed the conference room door herself before sitting across from me beneath dimmed lights overlooking the harbor. She asked whether I believed the operational discrepancies could still remain contained within reconciliation review. Contained. There was that word again. I answered carefully. I told her the exposure depended entirely on how deeply investigators reviewed authorization sequencing and subcontractor substitution timing. She went quiet immediately, then asked whether I had personally retained copies of historical operational approvals. That question mattered more than she realized. Because innocent executives ask about operational recovery. People protecting themselves ask about documentation visibility. I told her I maintained standard operational records necessary for continuity review. Technically true. Her shoulders relaxed slightly after that answer. Not fully, just enough. Then she said something I still remember clearly. The company needs consistency right now, not interpretation. That sentence explained the entire culture perfectly. Consistency meant protect the narrative. Interpretation meant connect the pattern. Afterward, I started noticing subtle containment behavior everywhere. Access permissions changed without announcement. Historical routing folders moved into restricted archives. Shared reconciliation drives disappeared temporarily during overnight maintenance windows. Even procurement coordinators started speaking more carefully near executive offices. The invisible map was tightening, not operationally, legally. About 10 days later, I arrived before sunrise and found one of my overnight analysts sitting alone outside the operations room looking pale and exhausted. He told me investigators requested archived subcontractor communications tied to Guam rerouting activity from the previous fiscal year. Then he added something quietly. Federal investigators already had most of the emails before requesting them internally. That detail hit harder than I expected, because it meant external systems already preserved the operational history independently. The company no longer controlled the timeline. That same afternoon, I reviewed another authorization sequence connected to emergency Pearl Harbor inventory balancing. My credentials appeared again, but this time the attached escalation approval chain included archived executive email references I had never seen before. And one of those emails carried the director's direct authorization signature approving continuity overrides 48 hours before the shortage officially existed anywhere inside the operational system. After that email surfaced, the company stopped behaving like a confident defense contractor. It started behaving like an institution preparing for controlled damage. Emergency executive meetings appeared across calendars almost daily. Subject lines became vague. Operational review alignment. Continuity coordination. Leadership synchronization. Nobody used the word investigation directly anymore. That silence felt deliberate. The director avoided discussing historical approvals openly after that point. Instead, she focused almost entirely on narrative framing. What investigators might misunderstand. How operational pressure created temporary documentation inconsistencies. Why continuity sometimes required accelerated authorization timing. The language became increasingly careful. I watched executives spend more energy explaining the system than stabilizing it. That imbalance mattered, because Pacific operations were still running 24 hours a day underneath the audit pressure. Containers still moved. Fuel systems still required support deliveries. Subcontractors still called overnight requesting emergency authorization adjustments. The invisible map continued expanding while leadership debated exposure management upstairs. One Thursday evening, I remained inside the operations center past 10 p.m. reviewing Guam reconciliation histories when corporate legal requested my presence in a private executive conference room. 3 people waited inside. The director, corporate counsel, a federal procurement investigator. That combination changed the temperature of the room immediately. Nobody offered coffee. Nobody pretended the meeting was casual. The investigator introduced himself calmly before opening a thin gray evidence binder. Then he slid several authorization summaries across the table. My credentials appeared repeatedly throughout the records. Emergency continuity overrides. Manual inventory balancing. Subcontractor substitution approvals. I recognized every operational event, but not every authorization sequence. The investigator asked whether I personally approved all associated override chains attached to my credentials. I answered carefully, no, not all associated chains. Corporate counsel stopped writing for several seconds after that sentence. The director remained completely still beside him. Then the investigator asked something more precise. Did you notice authorization timing irregularities before the audit review began? That question told me investigators already understood more than leadership realized. Because timing was the real exposure. Not shortages. Not accounting. Predictive authorization behavior. I explained that certain escalation records appeared to exist administratively before operational events officially entered reconciliation systems. The investigator nodded once. No surprise. No dramatic reaction. Just confirmation. Then he asked whether anyone inside leadership instructed me to maintain operational continuity outside formal documentation pathways. I thought carefully before answering, because technically nobody ever used direct language. The system itself encouraged undocumented flexibility through pressure, metrics, deadlines, executive visibility. Eventually, continuity became more important than process. That was the real mechanism, not conspiracy. Institutional conditioning. The investigator listened without interruption. Then he opened another section inside the binder. Several printed executive emails appeared beneath the authorization summaries. One carried the director's direct escalation approval. Another referenced shielding operational visibility before quarterly board review. Corporate counsel finally spoke for the first time. He asked whether I retained personal operational records outside standard company systems. The room became very quiet after that, because everyone understood what the question actually meant. They were no longer asking whether the system failed. They were trying to determine who could reconstruct the entire architecture afterward. Before answering, I looked toward the evidence binder again. Then I noticed something unexpected near the bottom corner of one printed authorization report. A secondary federal case reference number already existed beneath the audit file identifier. I recognized the federal case formatting immediately. That was not a standard procurement audit reference. It belonged to expanded investigative review. The room stayed silent while I looked at the document. Corporate counsel noticed my reaction first. He closed the binder halfway, without saying anything. Too late. I already understood what the secondary case number meant. Investigators were no longer reviewing missing inventory alone. They were examining authorization behavior across the operational structure itself. That changed the exposure level completely. The director still tried maintaining executive composure afterward. She shifted the conversation back toward operational stabilization and continuity protection. But her voice sounded different now, more careful, less controlled. The investigator eventually asked whether I would cooperate with additional procedural review if federal analysis expanded further. I answered yes. Simple. No hesitation. That response altered the room again. Because until that moment, leadership still believed operational loyalty might contain the architecture internally. They misunderstood something fundamental. I was loyal to continuity, not concealment. After the meeting ended, I remained alone inside the operations center until almost midnight, reviewing 3 years of reconciliation histories against subcontractor escalation timing. The invisible map finally became complete. Every unstable pattern connected back toward one operational philosophy. Protect delivery visibility first. Correct structural instability later. Eventually, later never arrived. Manual overrides became permanent operating behavior. Temporary substitutions became hidden infrastructure. Undocumented balancing became normalized continuity management. The company survived quarter after quarter because invisible operational labor absorbed instability before executives ever experienced consequences personally. That was the real architecture, not fraud in the cinematic sense. Dependency. The director never truly understood operations. She understood metrics, visibility, board confidence. But she failed to recognize that undocumented continuity systems create permanent forensic trails once enough institutions interact with them simultaneously. Navy procurement databases, subcontractor reporting systems, international freight reconciliation logs, federal authorization archives. The evidence existed everywhere now, not just internally. A week later, the atmosphere inside headquarters became almost unrecognizable. Executive assistants stopped scheduling future travel beyond 30 days. Corporate security quietly restricted archive access floors. Several senior managers suddenly began taking personal leave simultaneously. Nobody announced crisis formally, but the building already understood. One morning before sunrise, I entered the executive parking structure and noticed 2 federal vehicles beside the reserved leadership section. No emergency lights, no uniforms. Just quiet presence. That felt more unsettling somehow. Later that afternoon, one of my senior logistics coordinators approached my desk carefully while most managers attended another containment meeting upstairs. He handed me a printed internal facilities request without speaking initially. Then he pointed toward the bottom authorization section. Executive Evidence Preservation Support Preparation. Temporary Secure Archive Access. My stomach tightened slightly reading it. Because evidence preservation procedures happen near the end of containment, not the beginning. That meant investigators already anticipated document seizure expansion before leadership finished building its internal narrative. The director still did not seem to grasp the scale fully. That evening, she called me directly for the first time in almost 4 months. No assistant, no scheduling coordinator, just her voice. She asked whether I planned to support the company publicly once formal questioning expanded. I answered carefully. I told her I intended to support factual operational continuity documentation exactly as it existed historically. Silence followed for several seconds. Then she asked one final question before ending the call. Did you keep records outside the company systems? I looked toward the black notebook sitting beside my operations reports under the desk lamp. Then I answered truthfully, yes. And 40 minutes later, federal investigators initiated immediate evidence preservation access for the entire executive office floor. The executive floor changed overnight after evidence preservation began. Badge access restrictions expanded before sunrise. Conference room calendars disappeared from shared systems. Corporate security officers started standing quietly near legal offices without explanation. Nobody used the word seizure, but everyone understood what was happening. The director did not appear publicly for almost 2 days afterward. Rumors spread constantly through operations. Federal subpoenas, defense contract escalation, board emergency review. Most of the rumors were wrong. Reality inside corporate investigations usually looks quieter than people imagine. More procedural, more administrative, more dangerous. I spent most of that week inside operations review rooms reconstructing authorization timelines with investigators and procurement analysts. Not because they lacked data, because they needed continuity context. That was the hidden weakness leadership never anticipated. The systems recorded transactions. I understood behavior. Which shipment reroutes happened under real operational necessity? Which overrides appeared administratively staged? Which shortages existed physically versus temporarily balanced through undocumented substitutions? The invisible map finally aligned completely once investigators merged external procurement databases with internal authorization archives. That was the moment the architecture became undeniable. Not to me, to the board. Late Thursday afternoon, one federal analyst requested clarification regarding several executive continuity summaries prepared nearly 18 months earlier. The summaries referenced anticipated Pacific inventory instability before shortages officially entered operational reporting. I recognized the documents immediately. Board briefing drafts. The same language patterns appeared repeatedly throughout the audit expansion. Projected continuity exposure. Temporary balancing requirements. Authorization flexibility during accelerated deployment cycles. The board had already seen fragments of the truth long before the audit exploded publicly. Not everything, but enough. Enough to recognize recurring instability beneath the reporting structure. Enough to understand the company depended heavily on undocumented operational corrections. Enough to know delivery continuity metrics no longer matched operational reality fully. That realization changed how I viewed the entire collapse. Leadership was not hiding one mistake. The organization had slowly normalized protecting visibility over structural truth. The director became the public face of that culture. But the architecture existed far above one executive office. That was the final turn. The audit did not expose a hidden disaster. It exposed an institutional dependency everyone quietly benefited from while pretending the system remained stable. The board wanted continuity. Executives wanted growth metrics. Operations wanted survival. And invisible employees, like me, quietly absorbed the instability between all three. The executive meeting in San Diego suddenly looked different in hindsight. The director thought she was containing exposure publicly. But the board already understood enough to recognize the real danger immediately after I spoke. Not the money. Not the shortage. The authorization chain. Because authorization chains reveal institutional intent. The next morning, I returned briefly to the executive conference hall before sunrise. The same room where the director blamed me publicly. The harbor fog still covered the windows. Coffee cups still sat abandoned near the back tables from the emergency leadership sessions overnight. Then my phone vibrated. Tokyo headquarters. Private encrypted line. I answered quietly. A senior executive from Asia Pacific Regional Oversight introduced himself and asked whether I would be available immediately for temporary operational stabilization discussions outside United States jurisdiction before federal containment procedures expanded further. I flew to Tokyo 11 days later. Not as a promotion, not as a reward. More like controlled operational continuity during institutional restructuring. That distinction mattered to me. Federal review expanded quietly across multiple procurement layers after the executive floor preservation procedures began. The company never collapsed publicly. Most large defense contractors do not. They restructure. They isolate exposure. They replace language first, then leadership. The director disappeared from operational communications before the end of the quarter. No public announcement initially, just absence. Her executive calendar vanished from shared systems one Monday morning. By Wednesday, another interim leadership name appeared beside strategic operations oversight. That was how corporate America usually handled career-ending exposure. Quiet removal. Minimal visibility. Maximum containment. The board initiated independent procurement restructuring almost immediately afterward. Authorization chains changed. Continuity overrides required multi-layer verification. Subcontractor substitutions moved under external review authority. The systems became slower, more frustrating, but also more honest. For the first time in years, operational instability reached leadership visibility before exhausted employees absorbed it manually overnight. That change mattered more than any disciplinary outcome. I spent 6 months moving between Tokyo, Yokosuka, Guam, and Singapore, helping stabilize Pacific reporting architecture during the transition. Not because I believed the company deserved loyalty, because thousands of operational workers still depended on stable systems functioning correctly underneath executive restructuring. People rarely think about that during corporate scandals. Forklift operators still report before sunrise. Cargo teams still load shipments overnight. Schedulers still answer emergency calls at 2 a.m. Most institutional collapses never fully stop the machinery underneath them. They simply expose who was quietly carrying the weight all along. The black notebook stayed with me during the entire transition period. Not hidden anymore, just present. A record of how invisible operational labor slowly became institutional risk once leadership stopped respecting structural reality. Near the end of my final Tokyo assignment, a senior regional executive asked whether I planned to remain permanently inside Asia-Pacific oversight leadership. The compensation package was substantial. Executive housing, long-term relocation support, board visibility. 10 years earlier, I probably would have accepted immediately. Instead, I asked for time. That night, I walked alone through Shinagawa after midnight, carrying coffee and reviewing harbor freight schedules on my phone out of habit. Even across the Pacific, the patterns still looked familiar. Pressure, visibility, continuity. Every large organization eventually starts believing stable outcomes exist naturally. They forget someone invisible usually absorbs the instability manually behind the scenes. That misunderstanding destroys more institutions than incompetence ever does. I resigned 3 months later. Quietly. No speeches. No dramatic exit. Just documentation transition meetings and final operational handoffs. The company survived. The Navy contracts survived. The board survived. But the organization never fully looked at invisible operational labor the same way again. Neither did I. Sometimes I still think about the moment inside the San Diego conference hall when the director blamed me publicly before the investigators locked her office suite. People imagine institutional collapses begin with dramatic discoveries. Usually they begin much earlier, with exhausted employees fixing invisible problems silently while leadership mistakes continuity for stability. That was the real invisible map, not the audit, not the missing money. The dangerous belief that systems remain stable simply because the right people keep sacrificing themselves quietly enough for leadership never to notice the strain underneath them.